Last fall, I was sent to a small town in northern Pennsylvania for a 3-day repair job that I figured would be just another stop on a long list of service calls. I work in commercial refrigeration, and because our company was desperately understaffed, I had been driving hundreds of miles every week, fixing walk-in coolers and industrial freezers for grocery stores and restaurants scattered across rural towns. Most jobs blurred together after a while. This one never did. The town itself felt strangely abandoned, as though life had slowly drained out of it over the years. Most of the storefronts along the main street were boarded up. The few businesses that were still operating closed before sunset, leaving the streets almost completely empty by early evening. Even during daylight, the place carried a heavy silence that made every sound seem louder than it should have been. I was assigned to repair several aging walk-in freezers at an old family-owned supermarket that had probably been there for decades. Since there weren't any decent hotels nearby, my company reserved a room at a small roadside motel on the outskirts of town. I arrived a little after 7 on Thursday evening. The motel looked exactly like the kind of place you only stop at when you have absolutely no other choice. It was a single-story building shaped like a long rectangle, with every room opening directly onto the parking lot. There couldn't have been more than a dozen rooms, and only 4 or 5 vehicles were parked outside. The entire property looked frozen in another decade. The faded paint was peeling from the walls. Several light fixtures buzzed with dying fluorescent bulbs. The parking lot had cracks wide enough for weeds to grow through them. Even before I stepped inside the office, something about the place made me feel like I shouldn't stay there longer than necessary. The office smelled of stale coffee, old cigarettes that had long soaked into the walls, and harsh cleaning chemicals trying unsuccessfully to hide years of neglect. Behind the counter sat a woman in her 60s. She greeted me politely enough, but something about her behavior immediately caught my attention. Every few seconds while checking me in, she would glance over my shoulder toward the parking lot. Not casually, not absent-mindedly. She looked the way someone checks behind them after hearing an unfamiliar noise in an otherwise empty house. I found myself turning around once or twice, expecting to see someone standing behind me. There was never anyone there. When she finally handed me the room key, she hesitated for a brief second before speaking. "If someone knocks on your door tonight," she said quietly, "don't answer unless it's me or the owner." I laughed a little, assuming she was joking. She wasn't. "If you hear anything outside," she continued, "call the office. Don't go outside. Don't get involved." Her tone stayed calm, almost practiced, like she had repeated those exact words many times before. That unsettled me far more than if she had sounded frightened. I asked whether the neighborhood had a crime problem. She forced a smile that never reached her eyes. "We get drifters passing through sometimes," she said. "They bother guests now and then, mostly asking for money." The explanation sounded rehearsed, too simple, like it wasn't the whole truth. I didn't press her any further. After driving for nearly 6 hours, I was exhausted and only wanted a shower and a bed. My room sat near the far end of the building, second from the last. Inside it was reasonably clean, though every piece of furniture seemed older than I was. Cigarette burns covered the edge of the dresser. Dark stains marked sections of the carpet. The air conditioner rattled loudly enough to drown out smaller noises, and the room carried that familiar smell of old motel rooms that no amount of bleach can completely erase. I dropped off my overnight bag, drove to the only gas station still open, grabbed a microwave dinner and a bottle of water, then returned around 8. As I stepped out of my truck, something immediately caught my attention. An older dark green pickup truck was parked 2 spaces away from mine. Its engine was running. Its headlights were off. Inside sat a man, completely motionless. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't smoking. He wasn't adjusting the radio. Both hands rested perfectly on the steering wheel. His head faced straight ahead. When I walked past only a few feet away, he never acknowledged me. Most people instinctively glanced toward movement. He didn't. It almost looked as though he had been sitting there for hours, waiting for something that hadn't happened yet, or someone. A chill crept up my spine, but I convinced myself he was probably waiting for another guest. Nothing more. Inside my room, I locked the door behind me, ate dinner while watching random videos on my phone, answered a couple work emails, then finally took a shower. By around 10:30, I climbed into bed. Less than 20 minutes later, I heard footsteps outside. At first, I ignored them. People were staying here. Someone walking back to their room wasn't unusual, but then the footsteps stopped, directly outside my door. I waited to hear keys jingling. Nothing. I expected a knock. Nothing. No voices. No doors opening. Just silence. 15, maybe 20 seconds passed. Then the footsteps slowly continued toward the end of the building. I had barely relaxed when they returned. The same measured pace. The same deliberate rhythm. Step, 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 then they stopped in exactly the same place, outside my room, again. The silence this time felt much heavier. Whoever stood outside wasn't confused about which room belonged to them. They weren't searching for a key. They weren't talking on the phone. They were simply standing there, listening. Eventually the footsteps faded away once more. Curiosity got the better of me. I quietly approached the peephole. Nothing. The narrow walkway outside was completely empty. No one. Not a single movement. I told myself whoever it was had probably walked away just before I looked. That explanation made sense. At least it did until a little after 11. I had almost drifted to sleep when someone knocked. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just enough to make sure I heard them. I didn't answer. About 10 seconds later, the exact same knock came again. Same rhythm. Same force. Like whoever stood outside knew I was awake. I slipped quietly from bed and pressed my eye against the peephole. Nothing. No person. No shadow. No one walking away. The hallway was empty. Every hair on my arm stood up. That was impossible. There wasn't enough time for someone to knock and disappear without running. Yet I hadn't heard anyone running. As I stood there trying to understand what I had just witnessed, I noticed something else. The curtain beside the window had shifted open just enough to leave a narrow gap. From outside, anyone standing at the right angle could probably see straight into my room. How long had it been like that? Had someone been watching me the entire time? I immediately closed the curtain completely and turned off every light in the room. Now whoever was outside couldn't see me, but I couldn't see them either. For nearly 30 minutes I sat in complete darkness, listening. Every creak of the building sounded louder. Every gust of wind felt deliberate. Around midnight another sound reached me, a faint metallic scraping, very soft. Metal sliding against metal. It came from directly beside the door. I held my breath and crept toward the peephole as quietly as I could. This time I saw movement. Someone was crouching immediately beneath the peephole. Whoever it was knew exactly where the blind spot was. I could only make out the curved brim of a dark baseball cap and part of one shoulder. Nothing else. No face. No hands. Just enough to know someone had positioned themselves where I couldn't identify them. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. 5 seconds passed. Then the figure suddenly stood. Before I could react, hurried footsteps raced toward the far end of the motel. I grabbed my phone and called the front office. The woman answered, sounding irritated, clearly assuming I was calling about something minor. The moment I explained that someone had been crouching outside my door, her entire tone changed. She immediately asked one question. "You didn't open the door, did you?" I told her no. She let out what sounded like a quiet breath of relief. "Stay inside," she whispered. "Don't come out for any reason." Within minutes, headlights swept across the curtains as someone slowly drove through the parking lot. Then the vehicle disappeared. The office called back shortly afterward. The owner hadn't found anyone. She claimed it was probably someone fooling around, but her voice betrayed her. She didn't sound convinced. Neither was I. When I asked whether I should contact the police, she paused before saying they probably wouldn't respond unless whoever it was came back. That answer did absolutely nothing to reassure me. I barely slept for the rest of the night. Every tiny noise snapped me awake. The air conditioner clicking on, water moving through old pipes, the distant bark of a dog somewhere beyond the highway. Everything sounded like someone approaching my door again. Sometime after 3 in the morning, pure exhaustion finally overcame my fear. I must have fallen asleep. Then, at exactly 5:15, I woke violently to the sharp electronic chirp of my truck's door alarm. My eyes flew open. For a split second, I didn't even remember where I was. Then I heard it again. Someone had opened my truck. I climbed out of bed without making a sound and carefully pulled back only the smallest corner of the curtain. Standing beside the driver's door was a tall man wearing a dark jacket and a black cap. The truck door hung halfway open. His back faced my room. He wasn't searching frantically through the cab. He wasn't stealing tools. He stood completely still, almost as though he was listening, waiting for me to come outside. The man suddenly stopped walking. For a brief second, everything became unnaturally still. Then, without warning, he slowly turned his head toward my room. I froze. Even through the narrow gap in the curtain, I had the overwhelming feeling that he was looking directly at me. Not toward my truck, not toward the building. At me. It felt impossible. The room was completely dark, and I had barely moved the curtain enough to see outside. There should have been no way for him to know I was standing there. Yet every instinct in my body screamed that he did. He remained motionless for several long seconds, almost as if he were silently acknowledging that we had finally noticed each other. Then, with an unsettling calmness, he pushed my truck door shut. The metallic click echoed through the quiet parking lot. Without hurrying, he walked toward the road behind the motel. After several steps, his pace suddenly quickened until he disappeared into the darkness beyond the last streetlight. I didn't waste another second. This time I called 911. Unlike my conversation with the motel office, I wasn't asking for advice anymore. I wanted police there immediately. The officers arrived roughly 15 minutes later, though it felt closer to an hour. By then, the parking lot looked perfectly ordinary again. The silence had returned, making me question whether any of it had actually happened. The officers searched around my truck with flashlights, checked inside the cab, and dusted off a few areas where the man had touched the door. Nothing had been stolen. That wasn't surprising. I never leave valuables inside my vehicle, especially when I'm traveling for work. One of the younger officers asked if I was absolutely certain I had locked the truck. The question irritated me more than I expected. There was doubt in his voice. The kind of doubt people use when they already believe they've figured out the explanation. I looked him straight in the eye. I lock it every single night. There wasn't even a second of hesitation. I knew I had locked it. The older officer, however, wasn't focused on the truck. His attention shifted the moment I described the footsteps, the knocking, and especially the figure crouching beneath my peephole. His expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough that I noticed. He asked the motel owner whether security cameras covered the property. The owner reluctantly admitted they only had 2 aging cameras. One pointed toward the office entrance. The other watched vehicles entering from the highway. Neither camera captured the long side of the building where my room sat. In other words, the exact place where everything had happened wasn't being recorded at all. Before leaving, the older officer walked back toward me while his partner returned to the cruiser. He lowered his voice. "If anything happens tonight," he paused, "don't open that door." His eyes stayed locked on mine. "Not for anyone." I nodded. Then he added one more sentence that lingered in my mind long after he drove away. "If you can leave first thing in the morning, do it." I asked whether he thought this was random. He answered with a single word, "Probably." But his face betrayed him. It wasn't the face of someone convinced by his own answer. It was the face of someone who had seen something before and wasn't ready to talk about it. I seriously considered checking out right then. Every instinct told me to drive until I found another motel, even if it meant another hour or 2 on the highway. But I had already committed to the repair job. The supermarket depended on those freezers, and my company had nobody else available. More than anything, I convinced myself exhaustion was magnifying my fear. Maybe I was connecting unrelated events. Maybe the man really had just been trying car doors. By sunrise, everything would seem ridiculous. That was what I kept telling myself. The next day passed without incident. From 7 in the morning until almost 6 in the evening, I buried myself in work. Compressor failures, electrical testing, replacing worn expansion valves. For nearly 11 hours, I forgot about the motel entirely. It almost worked. Almost. The moment I turned back onto that lonely road at dusk, every uneasy feeling returned. The motel looked exactly the same. Too quiet. Too empty. As if it had been waiting. This time I parked directly beneath the brightest light I could find. I unloaded every toolbox, every bag, every piece of equipment in a single trip because I had already decided I wasn't walking back outside after dark. The woman at the office recognized me immediately. She studied my face for a moment. "You look exhausted." I didn't sleep. That answer seemed to confirm something for her. She hesitated before quietly offering to move me into room 2 beside the office. I immediately asked why she hadn't suggested that the previous night. She looked uncomfortable. I didn't think it would be necessary. Something about that answer felt incomplete. Then she muttered a sentence so softly I almost missed it. "It usually doesn't happen 2 nights in a row." The words hit me like ice water. I stared at her. "What usually doesn't?" The color drained from her face. She quickly corrected herself. "I mean, the drifters." She forced an awkward smile. "They usually move on." I nodded. But inside, every alarm bell was ringing. People don't accidentally say things like that. Especially not after everything that had already happened. For several minutes I actually stood beside my truck debating whether to leave. Nothing about staying there felt smart anymore. But I was physically drained, covered in grease, and the thought of driving another 100 miles was almost unbearable. Against my better judgment, I stayed. Around 8 that evening, I picked up dinner from the gas station and returned to my room. I had barely started eating when I heard the low rumble of an engine outside. Slow, deliberate. Not passing by, circling. I carefully pulled back one corner of the curtain. My stomach tightened instantly. The same dark green pickup. There was no mistaking it. It rolled slowly past my room without stopping, reached the far end of the lot. made a lazy turn, then parked facing the motel, its headlights shut off. The engine continued idling. The windshield reflected almost nothing. Whoever sat inside remained completely invisible, watching, waiting. I called the office immediately. This time the owner answered. Unlike the woman, he sounded more irritated than concerned. "If the truck isn't blocking your vehicle or damaging property, there's nothing I can do." His response felt rehearsed, as though complaints like mine weren't unusual. I asked whether he recognized the truck. He simply replied that people came and went all the time. Then he ended the conversation. That was it. No checking outside. No concern. No offer to call police. Nothing. For nearly an hour I watched that truck. It never moved. Eventually I shut off every light, left my clothes and boots on, and lay down fully dressed. Sleep never came. Sometime after 11, the footsteps returned. Slow, painfully slow. Each step seemed perfectly measured, not wandering, not searching, approaching, then stopping. Right outside my window, a tiny tap touched the glass. Not the door, the window. I didn't move. Another tap, closer to the center. Then came a sound I'll never forget. Something sharp, maybe a fingernail, slowly dragged downward across the glass. The scraping lasted only a few seconds. It felt like several minutes. Every nerve in my body locked up. Whoever stood outside wasn't trying to get my attention. They already knew I was inside. They wanted me to know they were only inches away. I quietly picked up my phone and began dialing 911. Before I could press the final button, another noise interrupted. The tiny frosted bathroom window rattled. Once, twice. Then silence. My eyes never left the bathroom door. Before I could even process that sound, another one came from somewhere even worse. The room next to mine. I heard metal moving inside the lock. Not someone inserting a room key normally. Something slower, more careful. Then, the unmistakable click of the door opening. That room had been vacant since I arrived. I knew because I had watched it the previous evening. New car. No lights. No guests. Now someone was inside. Very quietly, I slid off the bed and crouched beside the shared wall. Movement. Soft, shifting. Almost impossibly careful. Not the noises of someone unpacking luggage. Not footsteps. More like someone trying to remain completely silent while positioning themselves. My hands were shaking as I finally completed the 911 call. I whispered every detail. The dispatcher repeatedly told me to stay on the line. Stay inside. Do not confront anyone. As I described what I was hearing, a loud impact slammed into the wall behind my headboard. One solid hit, as though someone was testing the thickness of the wall. A few seconds later, another strike. Lower this time, closer to the floor. Then nothing. Absolute silence. The kind that becomes unbearable because your imagination fills every empty second. I realized I could hear my own heartbeat echoing inside the room. Then the bathroom window moved again, not rattling, opening very slowly, barely an inch. I sprinted into the bathroom and shoved the window shut with both hands. Something pushed back, only once. Not violently, just enough pressure to let me know there was another person on the opposite side, a living person. Trying the window, I slammed the latch into place, though it looked flimsy enough to break with a single hard shove. I backed away, unable to take my eyes off it. The dispatcher suddenly spoke louder. "The officers are almost there. Stay where you are." Almost immediately, I heard movement outside my front door again. This time there wasn't just one person. There were multiple sets of footsteps, different rhythms, different weights. Whoever had come wasn't alone anymore. Then came the same gentle knocking from the previous night. 3 slow taps, almost polite, as though someone expected to be invited inside. I remained perfectly still, not even breathing normally. Finally, I grabbed the heavy wooden chair from the corner of the room and jammed it beneath the doorknob. I knew it wouldn't stop anyone determined to enter, but doing nothing felt even worse. The next 60 seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. Then, bright headlights suddenly swept across the curtains. Police. The instant those lights appeared, the footsteps exploded into a sprint. Not one person, at least 2, maybe more, running in different directions across the gravel. By the time officers reached my room, whoever had surrounded it had vanished into the darkness. The investigation revealed details that made my blood run cold. The insect screen covering my bedroom window had been carefully removed and tossed into nearby bushes. Fresh pry marks scarred my truck door. Even more disturbing, the supposedly vacant room beside mine showed clear signs that someone had forced their way inside. Whoever had entered that room hadn't rented it. They had broken into it. Later that night, after everything settled down, the older officer asked to speak with me privately. His expression was far more serious than before. He asked whether anyone had reason to target me, whether I had argued with someone, whether I had posted online that I was staying at that motel. I answered no to every question. He remained quiet for several seconds before finally telling me something he clearly hadn't wanted to say earlier. They already knew about the green pickup. It had appeared before. During the previous 6 months, 2 other men traveling alone for work had reported suspicious activity at this exact motel. Both had discovered someone attempting to break into their vehicles during the night. One of them also reported hearing multiple people outside his room. He became so frightened that he packed everything into his truck before sunrise and drove away without ever filing a complete report. The officer looked toward the dark parking lot before speaking one final sentence. "We've never managed to identify who was inside that truck." Then he looked back at me. And that's the part that bothers me the most. The second victim's story disturbed me even more. According to the older officer, that man had gone to sleep believing he was safe behind a locked motel door. Sometime during the night, he woke for reasons he still couldn't explain. When he opened his eyes, the room felt strangely different. It took him several seconds to realize why. His motel door was standing slightly open, only a few inches, just enough to create a thin strip of darkness leading into the room. He swore he had locked it before going to bed. He remembered checking the deadbolt twice. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing had been damaged. Whoever had entered wasn't interested in money. That detail bothered investigators far more than an ordinary burglary would have. The older officer admitted they believed the same small group had been targeting men traveling alone, especially workers staying in inexpensive roadside motels. Construction crews, truck drivers, contractors, mechanics, repair technicians, people with routines, people who arrived tired, people who usually had no family nearby to notice if something went wrong. According to him, they would quietly observe their targets at gas stations, bars, restaurants, or job sites before waiting until the victims were isolated for the night. He never explained what investigators believed would have happened if someone had opened the motel door. He didn't need to. Some questions are more terrifying when they remain unanswered. That silence said everything. As 2 officers remained outside my room, I hurriedly packed every piece of equipment I had brought with me. For the first time in my life, I had checked beneath the motel bed before leaving. Normally, I would have laughed at the idea. This time it felt necessary. At first, I saw nothing except dust and a few forgotten bottle caps. Then my phone charger slipped from my hand and disappeared underneath. When I reached down to retrieve it, my fingers brushed against a folded piece of paper shoved almost against the wall. I pulled it out. It wasn't a note. It was a torn square from a local newspaper. On the blank side, written neatly in blue ink, were only 2 things: my room number, my truck's license plate, nothing else. No message, no name, no explanation. The realization hit me immediately. Whoever had been outside my room hadn't chosen me by accident. Someone had watched me, long enough to memorize where I slept, long enough to record which vehicle belonged to me, long enough to plan. That tiny scrap of paper frightened me more than every knock I had heard during those 2 nights, because it proved something I desperately wanted to believe wasn't true. I had never been dealing with random strangers. I had been dealing with people who had already decided I was their target. I left the motel before 1 o'clock that morning. I didn't wait for daylight. I didn't care that I still had another full day of work scheduled. I drove nearly 2 hours home without stopping once. Every pair of headlights behind me made me grip the steering wheel tighter. Every green pickup I passed made my pulse race. My company eventually sent another technician to finish the repair. He refused to stay at that motel. Instead, he booked a room in another town nearly 40 miles away. To this day, I have no idea who those men were. I don't know what they ultimately wanted. I don't know whether police ever identified the truck. Sometimes uncertainty is worse than knowing the truth, because your mind keeps inventing possibilities far darker than any official answer could ever provide. For a long time, I avoided thinking about those nights. Eventually, I convinced myself I had moved on, at least until someone asked why I never stay in roadside motels anymore. Then every sound, every knock, every slow set of footsteps comes rushing back as vividly as if it happened yesterday. Several months later, I heard another story. Unlike mine, this one didn't begin at an isolated motel. It began with a dating app. At first, nothing about it sounded unusual. October 2025. A young woman, single and hoping to meet someone new, downloaded Tinder after encouragement from friends. She expected awkward conversations, a few disappointing matches, maybe even someone worth meeting. After only a handful of swipes, she matched with a man named Killian. The notification made her smile. She sent the first message. A simple greeting, nothing remarkable. He replied almost immediately. Their conversation flowed naturally. Morning messages became afternoon conversations. Afternoons became late-night chats. Within days, they were talking almost constantly. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary, until it wasn't. The change was subtle at first. His messages became increasingly personal. He wanted to know where she was, who she spent time with, whether she had spoken to other men. She assumed he was simply becoming attached. After all, they had been talking every day. Then the possessiveness intensified. He stopped speaking like someone getting to know her. He started speaking like someone who believed he already owned her. One evening, he sent a message she would never forget. "You're mine." At first, she laughed nervously, assuming it was a terrible joke. Then another message arrived. "If I can't have you, nobody can." Moments later came the sentence that transformed simple discomfort into genuine fear. "If you ever block me or disappear, I'll kill you." Reading those words made her stomach tighten. The most disturbing part was that they had never even dated. They had never held hands, never kissed, never met in person. Yet somehow he behaved as though she belonged to him. For weeks she tried keeping conversations polite, hoping he would lose interest naturally. Instead, his obsession only deepened. Then, without warning, everything stopped. In December, he suddenly removed her from Snapchat. No explanation. No argument. Nothing. She felt relieved. Maybe he had finally moved on. Life slowly returned to normal. Weeks passed. Then, one evening, completely out of nowhere, another notification appeared. He had added her again. The moment she saw his name, memories of those threats flooded back. Instead of ignoring the request, she accepted it. Not because she wanted to, because she was afraid of what refusing might provoke. His first message chilled her immediately. "I've been thinking about your beautiful smile for 8 weeks. Another message followed almost instantly. "I keep wondering what we could have been if I hadn't let my dark thoughts win." There was something deeply unsettling about the wording. Not romantic. Not apologetic. More like someone trying to convince himself he deserved another chance despite believing his own thoughts were dangerous. Wanting to avoid angering him, she answered politely, just enough to keep the conversation calm. From that moment on, she responded out of fear rather than interest. He resumed acting like an intensely possessive boyfriend. "Where are you? Who are you with? What are you doing? Why didn't you answer sooner?" The questions became constant. Then he repeatedly asked her to enable SnapMap. He insisted it was only so he could make sure she was safe. She refused every time. Something deep inside warned her that allowing him to see her location would be a terrible mistake. She trusted that instinct. She had no idea he no longer needed her permission. Late Thursday night, she spent several hours driving around town with a close friend. They talked, listened to music, and eventually headed home around 1 in the morning. Her friend dropped her off at the entrance to the narrow alley leading toward her house. They exchanged goodbyes. She began walking alone. The neighborhood was almost silent. Only distant traffic and the occasional rustle of wind broke the darkness. Halfway down the alley, she noticed a man standing ahead. She barely glanced at him. People occasionally walked through there. Nothing seemed unusual, until he calmly spoke her name. She stopped instantly. Confused, she answered without thinking. "Yes, who's asking?" The man stepped forward just enough for the weak streetlight to illuminate his face. Every ounce of warmth drained from her body. It was Killian. She had never told him where she lived. Never once. For one impossible second, her mind refused to process what she was seeing. Then panic took over. Her heart pounded violently against her ribs. Her hands became ice cold. Every survival instinct screamed at her to run. She never had the chance. He crossed the distance in an instant and seized her by the throat. His grip tightened with shocking force as he slammed her backward into the brick wall. The impact exploded through her head. Stars burst across her vision. Instead of shouting, instead of raging, he stared. His face hovered only inches from hers, as though he were studying every feature, searching for evidence that she had somehow betrayed him. His voice remained strangely controlled, almost calm. "Who were you with?" His fingers tightened. "Why were you out this late?" She struggled desperately to breathe. Another question followed. Was it another man? The questions weren't requests for answers. They sounded like accusations already decided in his mind. She tried to speak, but almost no air reached her lungs. Her vision blurred. Tears streamed uncontrollably as she clawed at his hand. Nothing weakened his grip. She truly believed she was about to die. Then, without warning, he released just enough pressure to hurl her violently to the ground. The side of her head struck the pavement. Pain exploded through her skull. She gasped desperately for air, each breath burning her throat. Looking up at him from the ground made the situation somehow even more horrifying. His face showed absolutely nothing. No anger, no guilt, no hesitation, no satisfaction. Just a terrifying emptiness. The absence of emotion frightened her more than rage ever could. It was as if she were no longer a person standing before him, only an object he believed belonged to him. A second later, he dropped down on top of her, pinning her to the pavement. A violent slap cracked across her face with enough force to make her ears ring. She instinctively raised one hand to her burning cheek as tears blurred her vision once again. Before she could recover, his hands returned to her throat. This time they squeezed even harder. The world around her began fading. The sounds of the alley drifted farther away. The night sky above became strangely distant. In that terrifying moment, as darkness crept in around the edges of her vision, one unexpected memory surfaced. She thought about her dog that had passed away years before, not because it made sense, but because the human mind reaches for the people and memories that once made it feel safe when it believes the end may be only moments away. My vision had already begun to narrow. The edges of the world were fading into darkness, and the pressure around my throat had become so overwhelming that I stopped fighting as hard as I had only seconds before. A strange calm settled over me. People always imagine panic is the last thing they would feel in a moment like that. For me, it wasn't. Terror had burned through every part of my body until there was almost nothing left. What replaced it was something I still can't explain. My thoughts slowed. The pain became distant. I remember staring into the empty night sky and, for reasons that made no sense, thinking about my dog who had died years earlier. I even caught myself smiling faintly, not because I was happy, but because my mind seemed to be drifting somewhere far away from what was happening. Then everything changed. His hand suddenly released my throat. Air rushed painfully back into my lungs, making me cough so violently that I could barely breathe. He looked over his shoulder as if he had just remembered something important. Then he muttered a sentence so absurd that even today it haunts me more than the attack itself. Damn, I have to go. The last bus leaves in 3 minutes. Without another word, he turned and sprinted into the darkness. For several seconds, I couldn't understand what had happened. The man who had convinced me I was about to die had simply left, not because he had changed his mind, not because someone interrupted him, only because he didn't want to miss a bus. That realization terrified me in a way I still struggle to explain. It meant my life had been spared by something completely random. If transportation had been different, if the bus schedule had been later, if he had owned a car, I might never have survived that alley. I remained on the cold pavement, shaking uncontrollably as I struggled to draw full breaths into lungs that no longer seemed to work properly. My throat felt as though it had been crushed. Every swallow burned. Every breath scraped painfully inside my neck. I knew I needed help. Somehow I managed to unlock my phone and call my best friend. When he answered, I tried desperately to explain what had happened. Nothing came out. Not a single recognizable word. The damage to my throat left me unable to speak. All he heard were broken gasps, coughing, and desperate attempts to force sound through swollen vocal cords. Fortunately, he knew me well enough to understand that something was terribly wrong. He didn't waste time asking questions. He simply said he was coming. I don't remember much about the next hour. Shock has a way of stealing pieces of your memory. I remember sitting in his car wrapped in a blanket. I remember him repeatedly asking whether I could breathe. I remember reaching his house. After that, nothing. The exhaustion hit me like a wave. Within minutes of lying down on his couch, I lost consciousness. While I slept, my friend contacted the police and explained everything that had happened. The following morning, he drove me to the police station where investigators spent hours taking my statement. The officers listened carefully as I described the online messages, the threats, and the attack. By the end of the interview, they told me something I hadn't expected. They believed I remained in immediate danger. Instead of simply sending me home, they issued emergency safety equipment, including a personal alarm and a GPS emergency device capable of transmitting my exact location directly to dispatch if I pressed the emergency button. One officer explained why. They believed there was a significant chance he would try again. Hearing those words out loud made everything feel painfully real. The nightmare hadn't ended. It had only changed. Only 3 days before sharing my story, I noticed someone following me through town. Police later connected the person to Killian. Had a friend not been waiting nearby to pick me up that afternoon, investigators admitted the outcome could have been far worse. Eventually, detectives told me something that still echoes in my mind every time I leave home. Based on everything they had uncovered, they believed his intention during the attack had not been to frighten me. They believed he intended to kill me. According to them, the only reason I survived may have been pure chance. A bus schedule. Nothing more. Since then, ordinary routines have become sources of anxiety. Walking home after dark, looking over my shoulder in parking lots, hearing footsteps behind me, every unfamiliar face makes me wonder whether someone is watching. He once told me he always would be. I don't know whether that was another threat or simply another attempt to control me, but those words remain with me. Sometimes I catch myself scanning dark alleyways before walking past them. Sometimes I imagine someone waiting just beyond the nearest streetlight. Sometimes I instinctively reach for the emergency alarm before realizing nothing is actually there. Living with fear isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's checking every reflection in every window. Sometimes it's changing routes home without even realizing you're doing it. Sometimes it's wondering whether you'll recognize danger before it's too late. I wanted to tell this story because I learned something the hard way. Someone doesn't have to know where you live for them to find you. Sometimes they only need enough obsession and enough patience. Several months later, I came across another account that left me with the same uneasy feeling. This story belonged to a man named Mike. Unlike mine, his nightmare didn't begin in the city. It began with silence. It was last October when Mike decided he needed a break from work. Weeks of stress had left him mentally exhausted, and the idea of disappearing into the Smoky Mountains for a few peaceful days sounded exactly like what he needed. Solo camping wasn't new to him. He had done it several times before without incident. The mountains had always represented freedom, a place where the only sounds after sunset were wind moving through the trees and insects singing beneath the stars. He expected this trip to be no different. He left before sunrise, enjoying the long drive through winding highways and small mountain towns. Several hours before reaching the national park, hunger convinced him to stop at an aging roadside diner. It was the sort of place travelers often pass without noticing. Inside, only a handful of elderly locals sat quietly drinking coffee while a waitress moved between tables with the confidence of someone who had worked there for decades. Nothing felt unusual. Mike ordered a burger and fries, grateful for one last hot meal before heading into the wilderness. As he ate, however, he became aware of another customer seated a few stools away. The man wasn't openly staring. Instead, he kept glancing toward Mike in brief, almost calculated intervals, just enough to be noticed. Not enough to justify confrontation. Mike assumed the stranger had recognized him as someone from out of town. Eventually, the man struck up a conversation. Casual. Friendly. He asked where Mike was headed. Without thinking much about it, Mike mentioned he planned to spend several nights camping alone in the Smoky Mountains. The stranger simply nodded. Then he offered a quiet warning. Be careful out there. Mike smiled politely. What do you mean? The man shrugged. It gets real quiet after dark. That was all. No explanation. No story. Just those few words. At the time, they sounded like harmless small talk. Looking back, Mike wished he had paid more attention. By late afternoon, he reached a lonely trailhead with a small dirt parking area. No other vehicles. No hikers. No voices. Just endless forest stretching toward distant mountains. Most people might have taken the empty parking area as a reason to leave. Mike saw it as exactly what he had been hoping for. Peace. Privacy. Silence. He shouldered his backpack and started hiking. The trail twisted through dense woods where sunlight struggled to reach the forest floor. The hike took longer than expected, and by the time he found a suitable clearing, daylight was already slipping away. He hurried to pitch his tent, collect firewood, and organize his gear before darkness completely settled over the mountains. Soon, a small campfire crackled warmly beside him. Orange light pushed back the shadows just enough to create a comforting circle around the campsite. For a while, everything felt perfect. He roasted marshmallows, listened to insects humming beneath the trees, watched sparks drift upward into the darkening sky. The forest seemed alive in the peaceful way only wilderness can be. Then one sound broke the illusion. Footsteps. Not the cautious movement of deer. Not branches shifting in the wind. Human footsteps. Deliberate. Crunching slowly across dry leaves. Mike looked toward the sound. About 30 or 40 feet beyond the edge of the firelight stood a man, completely still, watching. The fading light concealed most of his features, leaving only a dark silhouette between the trees. He hadn't called out while approaching. He hadn't announced himself. He was simply there, as though he had been standing there for much longer than Mike realized. Trying to remain calm, Mike called out, "Everything okay?" The stranger stepped just far enough forward for the firelight to reach the outline of his face. He offered only a single word. "Hello?" Nothing more. No smile. No introduction. No explanation. Trying to keep the conversation normal, Mike asked whether he was camping nearby. Instead of answering, the stranger tilted his head slightly, then asked a question of his own. "You out here alone?" The words landed like ice. Mike instantly understood why that question mattered. He forced himself to sound relaxed. My friends are meeting me later. It was a complete lie. There were no friends. No nearby campers. No one who even knew his exact location. He hoped the lie might discourage the stranger from seeing him as an easy target. For several long seconds, the man simply stared. Then he nodded once, very slowly. Without another word, he turned and disappeared back into the trees. Mike never looked away. The stranger blended into the darkness until only moving shadows remained, just before vanishing completely. He stopped. Without turning his body, he slowly looked back toward the fire. He stopped. Even from where I sat beside the dying campfire, I could tell he had turned back toward me. He didn't wave. He didn't speak. He simply stood there again, perfectly still, facing my campsite. At first I wondered whether I was imagining it. The fire had burned low, and the darkness between the trees swallowed almost every detail. But after staring for several seconds, I could just make out the faint outline of his body against the slightly lighter horizon beyond the forest. He hadn't left. Something about that realization unsettled me far more than if he had walked directly into my campsite. People usually move. They shift their weight. They scratch an itch, check a phone, look around. This man did none of those things. He looked like part of the forest itself, frozen, watching. An uncomfortable thought crossed my mind. Maybe he thought the darkness was hiding him. Maybe he believed I couldn't see him anymore. I decided not to let him know I was still watching. Slowly, I lowered my eyes toward my phone, pretending to scroll through messages that I wasn't even reading. My heart was beating so loudly that it felt impossible anyone standing nearby wouldn't hear it. Every few seconds, I glanced back toward the trees. He hadn't moved. Minutes stretched by. The silence became almost unbearable. Eventually, when I looked up again, he was gone. Not gradually walking away. Not disappearing into the trees. Simply gone. That frightened me more than watching him leave would have. At least if I had seen him walk away, I would have known where he had gone. Now I knew nothing. He could have returned to another campsite. He could have continued hiking. Or he could have moved somewhere I couldn't see. That uncertainty settled into my thoughts like a weight. I remained beside the fire for another 20 or 30 minutes, pretending to relax while every sense I had focused on the darkness surrounding the clearing. The forest had changed. The insects still buzzed. The wind still stirred the branches. But none of it felt comforting anymore. The woods no longer sounded alive. They sounded like they were hiding something. Eventually, the fire collapsed into glowing embers. I poured water over the ashes until everything stopped hissing and reluctantly crawled into my tent. The thin nylon walls suddenly felt impossibly fragile. Only a few millimeters of fabric separated me from several acres of darkness. I kept telling myself the same thing over and over. You're overreacting. He's probably another camper. Maybe he was just curious. Maybe he thought you looked suspicious. Each explanation sounded reasonable. None of them convinced me. Sleep refused to come. Every tiny sound outside made my body tense. Roughly an hour later, I heard footsteps again. This time they weren't somewhere in the distance. They were inside my campsite. The sound of dry leaves being pressed beneath slow, deliberate footsteps circled my tent. One side, then another, then behind me. The pace was unhurried, almost patient, like whoever was outside had nowhere else to be. The footsteps completed one slow circle, then stopped, directly beside the tent. Silence. Not the peaceful silence of a quiet forest. The heavy silence that comes when another living person is standing only inches away waiting. I instinctively stopped breathing. I didn't consciously choose to. My body simply froze. Every muscle locked in place. I stared at the ceiling of the tent without blinking. The thin fabric revealed nothing beyond vague shadows. I couldn't tell whether someone was truly standing there or whether fear was filling in the blanks. Then I heard it. A slow exhale. So soft that under ordinary circumstances I probably never would have noticed it. Just one quiet breath outside the tent. Not exaggerated. Not intended to scare me. Simply the sound of another human being standing still, close enough that I could hear air leaving his lungs. My entire body went cold. Every instinct screamed at me to remain perfectly still. Don't unzip the tent. Don't speak. Don't shine a flashlight. Don't let whoever was outside know that I was awake. Sometimes survival isn't about fighting. Sometimes it's about convincing danger that you aren't worth noticing. I lay motionless. Seconds stretched into minutes. Minutes felt like hours. Eventually the footsteps resumed, slowly, gradually, moving away from the tent. Only after the sounds faded completely did I allow myself to breathe again. I kept waiting. 10 minutes passed. Maybe 15. Then The footsteps returned. Exactly the same pattern. A slow circle around the campsite. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Each step deliberate, each pause carefully placed. Again they stopped beside the tent. Again there was only silence. This continued throughout the night. Sometimes the footsteps disappeared for so long that I convinced myself whoever it was had finally left. Each time I started relaxing, they returned. Again and again. The routine never changed. Approach. Circle. Wait. Leave. Repeat. At some point I stopped checking the time. The night felt endless. What disturbed me most wasn't simply hearing footsteps. It was how impossible it became to judge where they were coming from. Sometimes they sounded to my left. Moments later, they seemed farther away than before. Then suddenly they were close again. The woods distorted distance in ways that made my imagination even more dangerous. As the hours passed, another unsettling thought began creeping into my mind. The rhythm no longer sounded consistent. I couldn't explain why. There wasn't any clear evidence, just a growing feeling that there might be more than one person moving through those trees. Perhaps fear was playing tricks on me. Perhaps echoes were bouncing through the forest. Or perhaps someone else had quietly joined the first man. That possibility sat in my mind for the rest of the night. At one point I noticed the inside of my tent gradually becoming lighter. Soft gray replaced complete darkness. Morning. I hadn't slept for even a minute. The realization shocked me. An entire night had disappeared while I lay frozen, listening. The moment there was enough daylight to see clearly, I made my decision. I wasn't staying another second. Forget breakfast. Forget coffee. Forget packing neatly. I shoved equipment into my backpack with trembling hands, barely paying attention to what went where. Every zipper sounded too loud. Every buckle clicking together made me glance nervously toward the trees. Finally, I reached for the tent zipper. I hesitated, took one deep breath, then pulled it open. The instant I stepped outside, the forest erupted with movement. Leaves exploded beneath multiple sets of running footsteps. Not one. Several. The sounds came from different directions almost simultaneously before racing deeper into the woods. I spun in circles, searching through the trees. Nothing. No faces. No voices. Only branches swaying where something had just passed. That was the moment every remaining doubt disappeared. I hadn't imagined any of it. Someone had remained near my campsite until sunrise. Possibly more than one person. Watching. Waiting. For reasons I still don't understand. I abandoned any attempt at organizing my gear. I stuffed whatever I could carry into my backpack, left several expensive items behind without even thinking about them, and started moving as quickly as possible toward the trailhead. Every few seconds I looked over my shoulder, expecting to see someone emerging from the trees. No one did. Yet I never once lost the feeling that unseen eyes followed me until I reached the parking area. When my car finally came into view, relief hit me so hard my knees nearly gave out. I climbed inside, locked every door, and sat gripping the steering wheel while trying to slow my breathing. The adrenaline crash arrived all at once. Somewhere during the morning, exhaustion finally overcame fear. Without meaning to, I fell asleep inside my locked vehicle. When I woke, the sun was high overhead. The daylight made everything seem less threatening. My rational mind slowly began arguing with my frightened one. Maybe there had been another group of campers. Maybe someone had simply wandered too close. Maybe I had misunderstood what I heard. Then I remembered something. In my rush to escape, I had abandoned much of my camping equipment. My tent, my sleeping bag, cooking supplies, other gear worth several $100s. It was broad daylight now. Surely whatever had happened overnight was over. Trying to convince myself that fear had exaggerated everything, I walked back down the trail. The forest looked completely different beneath the afternoon sun. Peaceful, beautiful, almost welcoming. When I reached the clearing, I stopped. Everything was gone. My tent had vanished. My sleeping bag was gone. The cookware. The backpack I had left behind. The food. Every single item. Nothing remained except the black circle of cold ashes where my fire had burned. I walked around the clearing several times trying to convince myself I had reached the wrong location. But I knew every rock, every fallen log, every crooked tree. This was my campsite. There was no mistake. Someone had removed every trace that I had ever been there. What unsettled me wasn't the theft itself. It was how completely everything had disappeared. No torn fabric. No scattered trash. No broken equipment. No footprints obvious enough to follow. Just an empty clearing that looked as though no camper had spent the night there at all. I didn't search any longer. I didn't call for help. I didn't try to recover what I'd lost. In that moment, none of the equipment mattered. The only thing that mattered was putting as much distance as possible between myself and those woods. I walked straight back to my car without looking behind me. I drove home that afternoon and never returned. I still enjoy the outdoors. I still love the mountains. But I no longer camp alone. Every now and then, usually late at night when a house settles or leaves scrape across the ground outside my window, my mind drifts back to that clearing. I wonder how many people were actually standing beyond the reach of my campfire. I wonder how close they came while I lay perfectly still, pretending to be asleep. And sometimes I find myself asking the one question I know I'll never have answered. If sunrise had arrived just a little later, would I have been the one who disappeared instead of my campsite?